What is the most unsettling archaeology discovery you have ever heard of? Story 1. I worked on a cemetery rescue dig in Coventry, UK, and it's one of those things that sticks with you in a way you don't really shake off. Because most of the time, when you're dealing with burials, there's a kind of stillness to it. Everything is settled. You're uncovering something that's been undisturbed for a long time, and there's a certain expectation of how it's going to look. But this one was different. We uncovered a skeleton that didn't look like it had just been laid to rest. The positioning was wrong. The body wasn't arranged in that typical, composed way you expect from a burial. It looked disturbed, like something had happened after the fact. The limbs were shifted, the posture was tense, almost contorted in a way that didn't match a peaceful death. And the more you looked at it, the more it started to make sense in the worst possible way. It looked like someone who had woken up after being buried. There were signs that suggested movement inside the grave, not just natural settling, but something more active, the kind of movement that doesn't happen unless someone is trying to get out. And that's the part that gets to you, because it turns what should be a quiet, historical discovery into something much more immediate, much more human. You're not just looking at remains anymore, you're looking at the aftermath of fear. Final, desperate fear. It's one of those things that doesn't feel distant, even though it's from the past, because you can picture it. And once you do, it doesn't really leave you. Story 2, Skeleton Lake is one of those discoveries that just keeps getting weirder the more you look into it. So, there's this lake high up in the Himalayas, known as Rupkund, and scattered all around it are human skeletons. Not one or two, hundreds. Just bones lying there, exposed when the ice melts. And for a long time, the explanation sounded strange, but at least somewhat contained. The idea was that a group of pilgrims get caught in a sudden, violent hailstorm, the kind with massive hailstones, and were ended on the spot. Some of the skulls even show blunt force trauma that lines up with that. So it was tragic, but it made sense. Until it didn't, because more recent studies started digging deeper, looking at DNA, diet, origins, and that's where everything starts to fall apart. Instead of one group from one time, it turns out these remains belong to multiple groups, from completely different periods. And not just local people either. Some of them appear to have come from regions as far away as the Mediterranean, which makes no sense. Why would people from such distant places, from entirely different time periods, all end up dying in the exact same remote location? And only some of them show signs of that hailstorm trauma. So maybe that explains one group. But what about the others? That's what makes it unsettling. It's not just a single tragic event you can wrap your head around. It's multiple, disconnected deaths, all converging in the same isolated place, with no clear, unified explanation. It feels less like a story, and more like pieces of different stories that somehow ended up in the same spot. And no one really knows why. Story 3. The Siege of Syracuse is one of those moments where history starts to feel almost unreal, like you're reading something that shouldn't exist for that time period. So, during the siege, the Romans were trying to take the city of Syracuse. And on the defending side, you had Archimedes. Yeah, that Archimedes. And instead of just basic defenses, what they encountered was something way more advanced than they were expecting. There are accounts describing strange weapons, machines that could launch projectiles with incredible force, cranes that could lift ships partially out of the water and drop them, and even what some sources describe as early forms of steam cannons, devices that used heat and pressure to fire projectiles, which sounds way too modern for ancient warfare, and that's what makes it unsettling, because if those descriptions are even partially accurate, it means there were technologies or concepts being experimented with that feel way ahead of their time, not fully developed in the way we'd recognize today, but close enough to make you pause. Imagine being a Roman soldier, expecting a conventional siege, and instead facing machines that seem almost mechanical, unpredictable, almost experimental, not just force, but ingenuity weaponized. Eventually, the Romans did take the city, But the fact that these kinds of devices were even described, whether exaggerated or not, leaves this strange impression that there were ideas and inventions in the ancient world that we don't fully understand or appreciate. And that's the unsettling part. Not just what we know, but what might have existed that we've lost, or only partially remember. Story 4. The Roman labor camp at the marble quarry in King Tut and the chemical warfare at Dura Europos are two of those discoveries that kind of mess with your sense of what the ancient world was actually like, because they feel way more modern than you'd expect. Like with King Tut in Tunisia, this wasn't just a quarry where people worked. It was essentially a forced labor camp tied to extracting marble for the Roman Empire. And when you look at the evidence, it's hard not to see it in a way that feels disturbingly familiar. You've got controlled labor, harsh conditions, people being worked in a system where they didn't really have a way out, all centered around resource extraction for a massive state power. And it starts to feel less like some distant ancient practice, and more like something you'd associate with much later periods in history. Then you've got Dura Europos in Syria, which somehow feels even more unsettling. During a siege, archaeologists found evidence that the defenders, likely the Persians, used what is basically an early form of chemical warfare. There's this tunnel where Roman soldiers had been digging to counter the siege, and when they broke through, they were hit with toxic fumes, probably from burning materials like sulfur and bitumen. And the result? A pile of bodies right there in the tunnel, soldiers who didn't die from swords or arrows, but from inhaling something designed to end them in a confined space, which sounds way too close to something you'd expect from much later in history. And that's what ties both of these together. It's not just that they're brutal, a lot of ancient history is brutal. It's that they feel structured in a way that seems ahead of their time. Organized exploitation, weaponized chemistry, things we tend to associate with more advanced periods, already happening in forms that are recognizable if you look closely enough. And that's the unsettling part. Not that humans were violent or harsh, but the methods, the systems, the thinking behind it all feels a lot more familiar than we're comfortable admitting. Story 5. The idea that every civilization, no matter how powerful or advanced, eventually falls is one of those things that doesn't hit you all at once. It kind of creeps in the more you think about it, because when you look at history, it's a pattern. Empires rise, they expand, they stabilize, they reach a peak where everything seems permanent, and then, slowly or suddenly, they decline. Sometimes it's war, sometimes internal issues, sometimes things just erode over time. But the end result is always the same. They don't last. And what's unsettling about that isn't just the past, it's the implication. Because when you're living inside a system, it feels stable, like it's just how things are. The infrastructure, the culture, the institutions, it all feels solid, like it's gonna keep going indefinitely. But history doesn't really support that idea. There isn't an example of a civilization that just kept going forever without major transformation or collapse in some form. And that's where it gets a little uncomfortable, because statistically, eventually, our time comes too. Not necessarily in some dramatic, overnight way, but in a way that future people will look back on as that period before things changed. And the strange part is, when you read about past civilizations, they probably felt the same way we do now. Normal, stable, like things would continue. And they didn't. So, it's not just a historical pattern, it's something you are technically living inside of right now. And yeah, there's something a little sad about that. Not in a hopeless way, but in a way that makes everything feel a bit more temporary than it usually does. Story 6, Göbekli Tepe is one of those discoveries that completely messes with the timeline you thought made sense. Like, it forces you to rethink the order of how civilization is supposed to develop. Because for a long time, the general idea was pretty clean. First you get agriculture, people settle down, form villages, develop structures, and then eventually you get things like religion, monuments, large-scale construction. That was the sequence. Then Göbekli Tepe shows up in Turkey, and it just breaks that logic. You're talking about massive stone pillars arranged in complex circular structures, carved with animals and symbols, and they date back something like 11,000 to 12,000 years, which is thousands of years older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than what we thought were the earliest examples of organized monumental building. And here's the part that really makes it unsettling. It seems like the people who built it weren't even fully settled agricultural societies yet, which means somehow groups of hunter-gatherers organized themselves well enough to plan, carve, transport, and erect these massive stones without the kind of societal structure we assumed was necessary for that kind of project. So now the order gets flipped. Instead of civilization leading to monuments, it starts to look like maybe shared belief systems or gathering places like this might have actually helped create civilization. And that's such a weird shift, because it means we might have been thinking about the origins of complex society backwards this whole time. And that's what makes Göbekli Tepe feel so strange. It's not just old, it's out of place, like it belongs to a version of history that doesn't quite match the one we thought we understood. And once you realize that, it's hard not to wonder what else is sitting out there, waiting to do the same thing. Story 7. Maybe the headless Vikings of Dorset. This makes it sound more creepy. Deep in the desolate moors of Dorset, a chilling tale lingers, whispers of the headless Vikings, cursed souls condemned to roam the mist-laden landscape. Legend speaks of an ancient pact gone awry, where vengeful spirits, beheaded in a long-forgotten battle, rise each night seeking retribution. Their disembodied heads, lost to time, are said to have been scattered across the moors, still yearning for the bodies they once adorned. Locals tell of eerie, headless apparitions haunting moonlit nights, their spectral forms cloaked in ethereal mist. Some claim to have heard phantom cries echoing in the wind, a ghostly reminder of battles fought in ages past. As the tale goes, any who dare trespass upon the burial grounds risk awakening the wrath of the headless Vikings, condemned to join their spectral ranks. Whispers abound of lost wanderers stumbling upon decapitated statues eerily resembling long-forgotten warriors, frozen in a macabre dance of eternal vengeance. The air is thick with the unsettling notion that, beneath the silent moors, the headless echoes of a bygone era still echo their mournful cries. Story 8, Rongo-Rongo, is one of those things that doesn't just feel mysterious. It feels locked away in a way that's honestly kind of unsettling. So, on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, these wooden tablets were found in the 19th century, covered in these strange glyphs. Not random markings, but clearly a structured system, something intentional, something that looks like writing. And that alone is already a big deal. Because if it is writing, it would be one of the very few independently developed writing systems in human history. But here's the part that makes it eerie. No one can read it, not for lack of trying. People have studied it for decades, analyzed patterns, compared symbols, tried to match it to known languages, cultural references, anything. And nothing has fully cracked it. There's no Rosetta Stone equivalent, no key to translate it. It just sits there. Structured, deliberate, clearly meaningful, but completely silent. And to make it worse, a lot of the original knowledge tied to it seems to have been lost before it could be recorded. By the time outsiders started paying attention, whatever tradition or understanding existed around Rongo-Rongo was already fading or gone. So you're left with this situation where you know it meant something. You can see it. You can trace the patterns, the repetition, the organization. It's not random, but the meaning is just out of reach. And that's what makes it unsettling. It's not like an undeciphered symbol here or there. It's an entire system of communication that someone, at some point, fully understands. And now no one does. It's like finding a message that you know is important, but realizing you may never be able to read it. And that kind of knowledge, clearly there but permanently inaccessible, just sits in the background, quietly reminding you how much can be lost. Story 9. The Aztec death whistle is one of those things that sounds almost made up until you actually hear it. At first glance, it doesn't even look like much. Just a small, often skull-shaped clay object, something you might assume was decorative or ceremonial in a quiet, symbolic way. For a long time, that's basically how people treated them. Interesting artifacts, but nothing too intense. And then someone blew into one, and the sound that came out is not what you'd expect from something that size. It doesn't sound like a flute or a whistle or anything musical. It sounds like a human scream. Not a clean, clear scream either. Something distorted, almost layered, like multiple voices at once, high-pitched and chaotic in a way that feels instinctively wrong when you hear it. The kind of sound that triggers something in your brain immediately. And that's where it gets unsettling, because once you realize what it sounds like, you start thinking about how it might have been used. There are theories that they were used in rituals, maybe even in warfare. Imagine groups of people blowing these all at once, creating this wall of sound that doesn't sound natural, doesn't sound human in a normal way, just pure panic-inducing noise. And suddenly it's not just an artifact anymore. It's psychological. It's designed to make you feel something. Fear, confusion, unease, and the fact that something so small, so simple, can produce a sound that is intense, make it stick with you. Because it's not just what it is, it's what it does. And once you've heard it, it's hard to forget. Story 10. The labyrinth next to the Hawara pyramid is one of those things that sounds almost mythical, except it was actually described by multiple ancient writers like it was a real, physical place. And not just any place, something massive, complex, almost impossible to fully comprehend. Herodotus wrote about it, and he basically said it was more impressive than the pyramids, which is a wild statement on its own. He described thousands of rooms, corridors, chambers both above and below ground, arranged in a way that was so intricate you could get completely lost inside it. Not just a building, a maze on a scale that doesn't really make sense. Later sources mention it too, all pointing to something that clearly existed near the Hawara pyramid in Egypt. And then, it's gone. Or, at least, that's the official version, said to be destroyed, lost, dismantled over time. But here's where it gets unsettling. There's evidence suggesting it might not actually be gone at all, that it could still be there, buried underground, largely untouched, sitting beneath the surface in a way that hasn't been fully excavated or explored in modern times. Which raises a really strange question. If something that significant, that massive, that historically documented could still be sitting there, why don't we know more about it? Why isn't it one of the most talked about sites? And that's what makes it feel different from a lot of other discoveries. It's not just something lost in the past. It might still be there, right now, just out of reach. And the idea that something potentially that important could exist, mostly ignored or unexplored, that's the part that really sticks with you, because it makes you wonder how much is still hidden. Not because it vanished, but because we just haven't gone looking properly yet. Story 11. The decapitated gladiators found in places like Roman York are one of those discoveries that quietly shift how you picture something you thought you already understood. Because when people think of gladiators, it's usually through that cinematic lens. The arena, the crowd, dramatic fights, maybe a quick, clean end if things go badly. But then archaeologists start uncovering these burial sites. And a lot of the skeletons are missing their heads, not just one or two, dozens. And the pattern doesn't look random. The cuts are clean, deliberate, often consistent with execution rather than chaotic combat. Some of the heads were even buried separately or placed in unusual positions, suggesting this wasn't just the result of battle, but something done after. Which changes the whole picture, because now it's not just about what happened in the arena, it's about what happened after. It suggests that for some of these individuals, death wasn't just part of the spectacle. It was controlled, systematic, maybe even ritualized in certain contexts. Execution-style ending, possibly tied to status, punishment, or simply the disposal of people who were seen as expendable. And when you zoom out, it starts to feel less like entertainment and more like an industry, a system, people trained, used, and then, when they were no longer needed, dealt with in a very final, very deliberate way. And that's what makes it unsettling, not just the violence, but how normalized it must have been. Because these weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns, and once you see that, it becomes harder to look at the idea of gladiators as just dramatic combat, and easier to see it as something much colder underneath. Story 12. Polish vampire burials are one of those discoveries that really mess with you, not because of anything supernatural, but because of what they say about how people thought and what they were afraid of. So, archaeologists in Poland have found these graves where the bodies were buried in very unusual ways, not just laid to rest, but actively restrained. We're talking sickles placed across the throat, stones shoved into mouths, bodies pinned down or positioned in ways that clearly weren't about respect or ceremony. It looks intentional, like whoever buried them wasn't just trying to honor the dead, they were trying to contain them. Because at the time, there was this fear that certain people could come back after death. Not as the kind of vampires you see in movies, but something more chaotic, more unsettling. The idea that the dead could rise and harm the living wasn't just a story, it was something people genuinely believed could happen. And these burials were meant to stop that. The sickle across the neck. The idea was that if the body tried to rise, it would be cut. The stone in the mouth, to prevent biting, feeding, or even speaking. It's all very physical, very deliberate, and that's what makes it eerie, because it's not symbolic. It's practical fear turned into action. These weren't people joking around or telling stories. They were so convinced something might happen that they took real, tangible steps to prevent it. And the people buried this way weren't always outsiders or criminals either. Sometimes they were just different, sick, unusual, maybe just unlucky, which adds another layer to it, because it shows how quickly fear can turn someone into something other than human in the eyes of others. And that's the part that sticks, not the idea of vampires, but the reality of what people will do when they believe something is out there, waiting to come back. Story 13. Remnants of witch hunts are one of those discoveries that don't feel distant or ancient in the way you expect. They feel uncomfortably close to something very human, like you're not just looking at history, but at a pattern of behavior that people are still capable of. Because when you first think about witch hunts, it's easy to treat them like exaggerated stories or something symbolic, like something that only happened in a more superstitious, less rational time. But then you start seeing the actual evidence. Graves, records, execution sites, even physical signs on remains. And it becomes very real, very grounded in something that actually happened to real people. And what makes it unsettling isn't just the violence itself, it's how normal it must have seemed to the people involved, how entire communities could become convinced that someone among them was dangerous or other based on rumors, illness, bad luck, or just being different in some small way. And once that idea took hold, it could escalate quickly into something irreversible. You find burials where people were treated differently, sometimes placed outside consecrated ground, sometimes showing signs consistent with execution, and when you pair that with written accounts of accusations and forced confessions, it starts to feel less like isolated incidents and more like a repeating pattern that shows up whenever fear and certainty combine in the wrong way. And that's really the part that sticks with you, because it's not just about what happened back then. It's about how easily people can convince themselves they're justified, how quickly suspicion can turn into action, and how once that momentum builds, it becomes very hard to stop. So when you look at those remains, you're not just looking at victims of a specific time period, you're looking at evidence of something that feels disturbingly familiar, something rooted in human behavior that hasn't completely gone away, which is what makes it feel less like distant history and more like something that could always exist just under the surface. Story 14. The discovery of a mummified lung is one of those things that sounds oddly specific at first, but the more you think about it, the more unsettling it becomes in a really quiet way. Because when you picture mummies or preserved remains, you usually think of entire bodies, something intact, something recognizable. But finding a single organ, like a lung, preserved across centuries or even thousands of years, hits differently. It's so specific, so personal. A lung is something that was once actively working, expanding and contracting, keeping someone alive moment by moment, and now it's just there, preserved, silent, disconnected from everything it used to be part of. And what makes it even stranger is how it gets preserved in the first place. Sometimes it's intentional, like in ancient embalming practices where organs were removed and treated separately. But other times, it's accidental, the result of unique environmental conditions that just happen to preserve that one part of the body while everything else decayed, which makes it feel almost random. Like out of an entire human life, this one piece is what made it through. And when researchers study something like that, they can sometimes learn a lot. Diseases, air quality, habits, even what kind of environment that person lived in, all from this one organ that outlasted everything else. But that doesn't make it less unsettling. If anything, it adds to it, because it turns something deeply human into an object of study, something that existed inside someone, now sitting outside of time in a completely different context. And that contrast is what sticks. It's not dramatic or violent. It's just quietly strange, a reminder of how parts of us can outlast the rest in ways that don't always make sense, and how even something as ordinary as a lung can end up feeling eerie. Story 15. The burial of Louise Duqueno, the Lady of Brefeyac, is one of those discoveries that starts off sounding romantic, and then slowly becomes something a lot more unsettling the more you picture it. So, she died in 1656, a widow, and when archaeologists examined her burial, they found something that wasn't just symbolic or decorative, but very literal. She was buried with her husband's heart, not metaphorically, actually preserved, placed in a container, and interred with her. And on one level, you can see what it meant. This idea of love lasting beyond death, of wanting to remain connected even after one person is gone, something physical to represent that bond, especially in a time where relics and bodily remains held a kind of spiritual significance. It's intense, but it makes sense in context. But at the same time, it's hard not to feel a little unsettled by it, because this isn't just memory or symbolism. It's a real human organ, removed, preserved, and then buried with someone else years later, like a piece of one life being carried forward into another's death. It blurs the line between devotion and something much more tangible, almost physical in a way that modern ideas of love don't usually go. And that's what makes it stick. Because it's not just a story about love. It's a reminder of how differently people have expressed that connection across time, sometimes in ways that feel beautiful, and at the same time, just a little bit eerie, like something deeply human, but also slightly hard to fully process. Story 16. The Franklin expedition, the one that set out in 1845 to find the Northwest Passage, is one of those stories that starts off like a classic exploration narrative, and then slowly turns into something much darker the more you learn about what actually happened. So, you've got 129 men, led by Sir John Franklin, heading into the Arctic with 2 ships, trying to map a route through one of the harshest environments on Earth. And at first, it probably felt like any other major expedition. Difficult, sure, but controlled, planned, something they believed they could handle. And then they just vanish. No contact, no survivors, nothing. For years, people didn't know what happened to them, which already adds this layer of mystery. But when evidence finally started to show up, abandoned ships, scattered camps, remains, it painted a picture that was far worse than anyone expected. Because this wasn't just a failed journey, it was a slow collapse. The crew got trapped in ice, completely cut off, with no way out, and over time everything started to break down. Supplies ran out, scurvy set in, the cold became constant, and survival turned into something desperate rather than strategic. And then there's the part that makes it truly unsettling. Evidence suggests that some of the men resorted to cannibalism, which means things got so bad, so far beyond recovery, that the last option left was one people don't even like to think about. And when you put it all together, it stops feeling like a story about exploration and starts feeling like a story about isolation, about being completely cut off in a place where rescue isn't coming, where the environment itself is working against you, and where every decision becomes more desperate than the last. And that's what sticks with you. Not just that they died, but how slowly, how harshly, and how far things had to go before it ended. Because it turns into this idea of discovery and adventure, into something much more human and much more unsettling. Story 17, the idea that someone with leprosy might have fought as a soldier in medieval Italy is one of those discoveries that quietly challenges a lot of assumptions people have about the past. Because when most people think of leprosy, they picture total isolation. Outcasts, separation, people pushed completely to the margins of society, feared and avoided at all costs. And that did happen in many places. But then you get this skeleton, unearthed in a medieval Italian cemetery, showing clear signs of leprosy, along with what looks like a sword wound, which immediately changes the picture, because now you're not looking at someone who was completely excluded. You're looking at someone who may have stood alongside others, fought alongside them, possibly even died in battle, and then was buried with the same group, rather than being separated out. And that's what makes it so interesting, and a little unsettling in its own way. Because it suggests that the way people were treated wasn't as uniform as we tend to imagine, that even something as stigmatized as leprosy didn't always mean complete social exile, and that in certain texts, like war, those boundaries could shift in ways that don't quite match the simplified version of history we're used to. It also raises questions about how visible or understood the disease was at the time, and whether people around him knew, accepted it, or simply prioritized something else, like survival or loyalty. And that's the part that sticks. Because it's not just about one individual. It's about realizing that even in periods we think we understand, there are details that don't quite fit the narrative. And those details tend to be the ones that change how you see everything else around them. Story 18. Every time you see news about a perfectly preserved woolly mammoth being pulled out of the permafrost, it's usually framed like this incredible scientific moment. And it is, to be fair, but there's this whole other side of it that doesn't get talked about as much. And once you start thinking about it, it gets a little unsettling, because those animals are preserved so well for a reason. They've been frozen, undisturbed, for tens of thousands of years, locked into permafrost that basically acted like a natural deep freezer. Skin, fur, even soft tissue are sometimes still intact, which is amazing, but also raises a question. What else has been frozen along with them? Because it's not just bones or flesh down there, it's entire ecosystems from another time, including bacteria, microorganisms, and potentially viruses that haven't been exposed to the modern world in a very, very long time. And while not everything survives or remains viable, there have already been cases where ancient microbes were revived under lab conditions, which makes it a lot less theoretical than people might assume. Then you add in the bigger picture. The reason we're finding more of these well-preserved specimens isn't just luck. It's because the permafrost is melting faster, largely due to rising global temperatures. And when that frozen ground starts to thaw, it doesn't just reveal things, it releases things. Carbon that's been trapped for thousands of years, methane, all contributing further to warming, which then leads to more melting. So it becomes this kind of feedback loop. More heat, more thawing, more release, more heat. And buried somewhere in that process are things that have been sealed away since long before humans were around to deal with them, which is what makes it unsettling. It's not just that we're discovering the past, It's that the conditions that kept it contained are changing, and we don't fully know what all of that includes. So, every time you see one of those discoveries, it's not just a window into history, it's also a reminder that some things were frozen for a reason, and now they're not. Story 19. Every time you see news about a perfectly preserved woolly mammoth being pulled out of the permafrost, it's usually framed like this incredible scientific moment. And it is, to be fair, but there's this whole other side of it that doesn't get talked about as much, and once you start thinking about it, it gets a little unsettling. Because those animals are preserved so well for a reason. They've been frozen, undisturbed, for tens of thousands of years, locked into permafrost that basically acted like a natural deep freezer. Skin, fur, even soft tissue are sometimes still intact, which is amazing, but also raises a question. What else has been frozen along with them? Because it's not just bones or flesh down there. It's entire ecosystems from another time, including bacteria, microorganisms, and potentially viruses that haven't been exposed to the modern world in a very, very long time. And while not everything survives or remains viable, there have already been cases where ancient microbes were revived under lab conditions, which makes it a lot less theoretical than people might assume. Then you add in the bigger picture. The reason we're finding more of these well-preserved specimens isn't just luck. It's because the permafrost is melting faster, largely due to rising global temperatures. And when that frozen ground starts to thaw, it doesn't just reveal things, it releases things. Carbon that's been trapped for thousands of years, methane, all contributing further to warming, which then leads to more melting. So it becomes this kind of feedback loop. More heat, more thawing, more release, more heat. And buried somewhere in that process are things that have been sealed away since long before humans were around to deal with them, which is what makes it unsettling. It's not just that we're discovering the past, it's that the conditions that kept it contained are changing, and we don't fully know what all of that includes. So every time you see one of those discoveries, it's not just a window into history, it's also a reminder that some things were frozen for a reason, and now they're not. Story 20, the story of how Kamehameha the Great unified Hawaii, is one of those things that gets told as this powerful moment of consolidation and leadership. But when you zoom in on certain parts of it, it gets a lot more intense than the simplified version people usually hear, especially the Battle of Nuuanu on Oahu. So, you've got Kamehameha's forces pushing against the main opposition, and the fighting drives the defenders up toward the Pali, these massive cliffs with basically nowhere else to go. And at that point, it stops being a traditional battle in the way people picture it. It turns into a trap. Because once they're up there, there's no real escape. And what happens next is where it becomes unsettling to picture, because accounts describe large numbers of warriors being forced back toward the edge, and many of them ultimately going over, whether pushed, forced, or driven there in the chaos. And the scale of it matters. We're not talking about a handful of people, but potentially hundreds, all in one place, at the edge of a cliff, with everything collapsing around them in a very literal sense. And when you think about it from their perspective, it's not just a defeat. It's being cornered in a way where the environment itself becomes part of the battle. The land, the height, the drop, all of it shaping how it ends. And that's what makes it stick. Because it's not just strategy or victory in an abstract sense. It's something very physical, very immediate, something you can almost visualize too clearly once you start thinking about it. It doesn't take away from the historical significance of what Kamehameha accomplished in unifying the islands. But it adds a layer that feels a lot heavier than the simplified version, because it reminds you that a lot of those moments of unification, no matter where they happen, come with scenes like that behind them. Story 21. The Minoans are one of those things that really mess with your sense of how complete history is, because you are talking about an entire civilization that was advanced, influential, and clearly important, and then just sort of disappeared from human awareness for thousands of years, like not declined slowly in a well-documented way. not remembered clearly through continuous records, just gone, to the point where later civilizations had myths and fragments about them, but no real understanding of who they actually were. And this wasn't some small isolated group either. This was a major Bronze Age civilization on Crete, with complex cities, massive palace structures like Knossos, sophisticated art, trade networks across the Mediterranean, all the markers of something significant and organized, and yet, for over 3,000 years, they were basically forgotten, buried, lost, turned into legend. Which is the part that gets unsettling when you really sit with it, because it means something that big, that developed, that is central to its time, can just vanish from active human memory almost completely, reduced to ruins that people didn't even fully understand until relatively recently. And when archaeologists finally started uncovering it again, it wasn't like rediscovering something that had been neatly preserved in history books. It was piecing together something that had been missing entirely. A civilization reconstructed from fragments. And that kind of forces you to think a little differently about everything else. Because if something like the Minoans could disappear from collective awareness for that long, it raises the question of what else might have existed and been lost in the same way, without even leaving enough behind to be rediscovered yet. And that's the part that sticks. Not just that they were forgotten, but that they could be forgotten at all, because it makes history feel a lot less complete than it usually does. More like a partial record, with entire chapters missing that we don't even know to look for. Story 22. The idea that Ramses II, one of the most powerful rulers in ancient history, may have died from something as seemingly small as a tooth abscess, is one of those things that really puts everything into perspective in a weird, unsettling way. Because this is someone who had everything: power, resources, influence, access to the best knowledge and care available at the time. Basically the closest thing to being untouchable in his world. And yet, something as simple as an infection in the mouth, something most people today would treat with antibiotics or a dental procedure, could have been enough to take him down. And that's the part that hits, because it reminds you how fragile people actually were, even at the highest levels. No matter how powerful you were, your body still had limits, and if something went wrong in the wrong way, there wasn't much anyone could do about it. And with a dental abscess specifically, it's not even that dramatic on the surface. It starts as pain, swelling, maybe something you try to ignore or endure. But if it spreads, if the infection gets into the bloodstream, it can turn into something life-threatening very quickly. And back then, there was no real way to stop that progression. So, you've got this contrast. One of the most powerful figures of his time, someone who commanded armies and built massive monuments. And the thing that might have ended his life is something invisible, internal, something that today wouldn't even register as a major threat in most cases. And that's what makes it unsettling, because it strips away that sense of invincibility. It shows that even at the top of everything, you're still vulnerable to something small, something preventable, something that doesn't care who you are. And honestly, the fact that people still underestimate how dangerous untreated infections like that can be today just makes it feel a little more real than it should. Story 23. The idea that there may have been entire civilizations living in the Amazon basin that disappeared without Europeans ever really seeing them, and that what we think of as untouched rainforest might actually be a kind of massive, overgrown garden, is one of those concepts that completely changes how you look at the world. Because for a long time, the Amazon was described as this rilled, pristine, almost untouched environment, something too dense and difficult to support large, complex societies. That was the assumption. But then evidence starts showing up. Earthworks, roads, settlements, terra preta, this incredibly fertile, human-made soil, patterns in vegetation that don't look random at all. And suddenly it starts to look like the forest wasn't just inhabited, it was managed, shaped, cultivated over long periods of time. Which means instead of a few scattered groups, you might have had large, organized populations living there, building systems that blended into the environment so well that once they were gone, the forest just grew over everything. And then you add in the timing. European diseases spread ahead of direct contact, moving through trade networks or indirect interactions, wiping out populations before Europeans even reached certain areas or understood what was there. So, entire societies could have collapsed without ever being documented, without anyone realizing what had been lost. And that's the part that really sticks, because it means there could have been cities, cultures, systems of knowledge that just disappeared quietly, leaving behind traces that only now are starting to be recognized for what they are. Not ruins in the traditional sense, but landscapes that were once shaped by people and then reclaimed. And once you start seeing the Amazon that way, it doesn't feel like untouched wilderness anymore. It feels like something layered, something that used to be alive in a completely different way, and then was slowly erased, not by conquest, but by something invisible, which somehow makes it even more unsettling. Because it's not just what was lost, it's how completely it was forgotten. Story 24, the idea of Homo erectus mining gold, is one of those things that immediately feels off, like it doesn't quite fit the picture most people have in their heads about early humans. Because when you think of Homo erectus, you're usually imagining something pretty straightforward: basic tools, survival-focused behavior, hunting, gathering, maybe some early fire use. Nothing that really suggests going out of your way to dig deep into the ground for something like gold. And that's where it gets weird, because gold isn't food. It's not a shelter. It doesn't help you survive in any obvious, immediate way. So, the idea that a species that early would dig something like 20-foot deep holes just to extract small amounts of it raises a really uncomfortable question. Why? Were they actually mining it intentionally? Or were they digging for something else entirely, like water, clay, or another resource, and just happened to encounter gold along the way? And if it was intentional, that opens up a whole different set of possibilities that don't quite line up with how we usually think about them. Because now you're talking about recognizing a material that doesn't have direct survival value, putting an effort to extract it, maybe even valuing it in some way that isn't purely practical, which starts to blur the line between what we consider primitive and what we consider symbolic or abstract thinking. And that's the part that sticks with you, because it suggests there might be behaviors, motivations, or levels of awareness in early humans that we don't fully understand yet, or that we've been underestimating, or it suggests we're misinterpreting what we're seeing. Either way, it leaves this gap between what we think we know and what might actually have been happening. And that gap is what makes it unsettling, because it's not just about gold. It's about realizing that even something as seemingly simple as early human behavior might be more complex than we've been comfortable assuming. Story 25. The discovery of King Richard III under a parking lot is one of those stories that feels almost unreal, like something written for dramatic effect. Except it actually happened, because for centuries, his burial place was basically lost. There were theories, guesses, debates about where he might have ended up after his death in 1485, but nothing confirmed. And over time, the landscape changed so much that whatever was there just got built over, forgotten, turned into something completely ordinary. In this case, a parking lot. And then during an excavation, almost by accident in the grand scheme of things, they uncover a skeleton. And at first it's just another set of remains, but then details start lining up. The location, the injuries, the curvature of the spine, and suddenly it becomes clear that this isn't just anyone. It's a king, a major historical figure, someone whose life and death had been studied, debated, and mythologized for hundreds of years, just lying there beneath asphalt the entire time. And that's what makes it unsettling in a quiet way, because it collapses that distance between important history and ordinary space. You've got people parking their cars, walking over it every day, completely unaware that something so significant is right beneath them. It makes history feel less like something distant and preserved, and more like something layered directly under your feet. Forgotten not because it disappeared entirely, but because it got covered over, repurposed, moved on from. And once you realize that, it kind of changes how you think about everything else around you. Because if something like that can be sitting unnoticed for so long, it makes you wonder what else is out there, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to dig a little deeper. Story 26, the Silurian hypothesis, is one of those ideas that doesn't sound that crazy at first. And then the more you think about it, the more it kind of quietly messes with your perception of time and history in a big way. Because the core question is simple. What if we're not the first industrialized species on Earth? Not aliens, not something external, something that evolved here on this planet a long, long time ago. And when you first hear that, it sounds like sci-fi. But then you start looking at the timeline. Modern humans have been industrialized for, maybe 200 years in a meaningful way? And organized civilization goes back maybe 10,000 years, which feels like a long time until you compare it to Earth's age, around 4.5 billion years. And suddenly that scale becomes hard to even process. Because in that amount of time, you don't just have room for one rise and fall of a complex species, you have room for countless cycles. Entire civilizations could have emerged, developed technology, maybe even reached levels comparable to or beyond ours, and then disappeared completely, not just socially, but physically, geologically erased over tens of millions of years. Because that's the key part people don't always think about. Time doesn't just pass, it destroys. Erosion, tectonic movement, subduction, sediment layers building up. Over millions of years, almost everything we've built would be gone, broken down, buried, recycled back into the earth itself. Cities flattened, materials degraded, even the most durable structures eventually reduced to something unrecognizable. So, if something like us existed 100 million years ago, what would actually be left? Maybe nothing obvious. Maybe just faint, ambiguous traces that wouldn't even clearly point to an industrial society. And that's what makes it unsettling. Not because there's proof that it happened, but because it's hard to prove that it didn't. Because the absence of evidence over that kind of time scale doesn't necessarily mean absence of existence. And once you start thinking about it that way, history stops feeling like a complete record and starts feeling like just the most recent layer. Which is a strange realization because it means everything we think of as the beginning might just be the beginning of what we can still see, not necessarily the first time it happened. Story 27, King Tut's tomb is one of those discoveries that's famous for all the right reasons. But if you stop and really think about it, there's also something kind of quietly sad about it that people don't always talk about. Because when you see those photos of the sealed entrance before it was opened, there's something about it that feels final in a way that's hard to explain. That seal had been intact for over 3,000 years, completely undisturbed. Everything inside is placed with intention, with meaning, with this belief that it would remain that way forever, or at least for as long as anything could last. It wasn't just a tomb, it was a resting place that was meant to stay closed. And for thousands of years it did, which is kind of incredible on its own. But then you get to the moment it's opened, and while it's obviously an amazing archaeological discovery, like objectively one of the most important ever, there's also this other feeling underneath it, like something private was made public, something that had been preserved in silence for millennia, suddenly exposed to light, to people, to cameras, to study. And you can't help but think about the intention behind it. Whoever sealed that tomb believed it would stay that way, that it would protect something, that it would last. And in a way, it did. Until it didn't. And that's what makes it feel a little unsettling. Not because it shouldn't have been studied or discovered, but because it's one of those rare moments where you can almost feel the boundary between past and present being crossed in a very direct way. Like you're witnessing the end of something that had quietly endured for thousands of years. And yeah, it gave us knowledge, insight, understanding. But at the same time, it also ended that long, uninterrupted stillness. And there's something about that just feels a little heavy. Story 28. I think one of the most unsettling parts of archaeology and paleontology isn't even what we've found, it's what we haven't. Because when you look at the fossil record, it feels like this massive, detailed archive of life on Earth, like we've got a decent picture of what came before us. But in reality, it's barely anything. Only a tiny fraction of all living things that ever existed actually fossilized, and an even smaller fraction of those have ever been found. The conditions have to be perfect: rapid burial, the right minerals, the right environment. Otherwise, everything just breaks down and disappears completely. So, what we're looking at isn't the full story. It's a handful of survivors. And that's where it starts to get a little unsettling, because it means that the vast majority of life that has ever existed on this planet is just gone. Not hidden somewhere waiting to be discovered, not buried in a way we'll eventually uncover, just erased, with no record left behind. Entire species, entire ecosystems, things that might have looked completely unlike anything we've ever seen, behaviors, interactions, entire evolutionary paths, all of it happened. And we will never know any of it, not even a glimpse. And when you really think about the scale of time, hundreds of millions, billions of years, it's not just a few missing pieces, it's almost everything, which kind of flips how you see the fossil record. Instead of being this complete window into the past, it's more like a few scattered pages from a book that was mostly burned. And the part that makes it stick is that there's no way around it. No technology, no future discovery is going to bring back what was never preserved in the first place. It's just gone. And that realization that most of Earth's history is something we will never be able to access, no matter how hard we try, is what makes it feel a little eerie. Not because of what we've found, but because of how much we never will. Story 29. Sometimes it's not even the artifact itself that's unsettling. It's the environment it's been sitting in the whole time. Because you picture archaeology as this careful, controlled process, brushing away dirt, uncovering objects, documenting history. But in reality, what's buried with those objects can be just as dangerous as anything you might imagine finding. There have been digs where everything had to stop because the soil itself turned out to be contaminated with things like arsenic, cadmium, or mercury, either from natural deposits or from past human activity, and suddenly what started as a historical excavation becomes a serious health risk. And the unsettling part isn't just that it exists, it's how invisible it is. You don't see it coming. There's no obvious warning sign when you first start digging, no visual cue that what you're disturbing could actually harm you just by being exposed to it, inhaled or absorbed over time. So, modern teams have protocols, testing, safety measures, all of that. But then you think about earlier excavations, Victorian or Edwardian digs, where people were out there uncovering sites with none of that awareness, no monitoring, no protective gear, just working directly in whatever conditions they encountered. And it makes you wonder how many of them were exposed to things they didn't even know were dangerous. How many long-term effects might have gone unnoticed or unconnected to the work they were doing, because they weren't just digging up the past. They were disturbing environments that had been sealed for decades, centuries, sometimes much longer, and whatever was trapped there came back into contact with them the moment it was exposed. And that's what makes it unsettling in a different way. Not dramatic, not obvious, just quietly dangerous. The kind of risk that doesn't announce itself, doesn't look threatening, but is there anyway, waiting to be uncovered along with everything else. Which kind of changes how you see the whole process, because it's not just about discovering what's buried, it's about what gets released when you do. Story 30. Evidence of a second extinction-level meteor impact is one of those things that doesn't just add to what we know about the past. It changes how you think about the stability of life on Earth altogether. Because most people know about the big one, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. and it's often treated like this singular, almost freak event, something incredibly rare that just happened once under very specific circumstances. But then you start seeing evidence that it wasn't just a one-off, that there have been other large impacts, some potentially powerful enough to cause massive disruptions to life on a global scale, even if they didn't leave behind as clear or well-preserved a record as the Chicxulub impact. And that's where it starts to feel unsettling, because once you move from "this happened once" to "this has happened multiple times," it stops feeling like an anomaly and starts feeling like part of a pattern. Not a frequent one on a human timescale, obviously, but over hundreds of millions or billions of years, it becomes something that's almost expected. And that kind of reframes things. Because life on Earth, as stable as it feels, has been interrupted before in very sudden, very violent ways that had nothing to do with what was happening on the planet itself. No warning, no buildup that anything living could really respond to. Just an external event that resets everything. And that's the part that sticks with you, because it's not something you can control, not something you can fully predict, and not something that cares how advanced or developed a species has become. It's just part of the environment on a cosmic scale, which means the idea of extinction-level impacts isn't just something in the distant past. It's something that belongs to the same universe we're still in. And that realization makes everything feel a little less permanent than it usually does. Story 31, the Sea Peoples are one of those things that feel less like a clear historical group, and more like a shadow moving through the edges of the record, and that's exactly what makes them so unsettling. Because around the Late Bronze Age, a huge number of civilizations around the Mediterranean just started collapsing or burning down, cities destroyed, trade networks falling apart, entire regions destabilizing in what looks like a pretty sudden chain reaction. And in the middle of all that chaos, you get these references to the Sea Peoples. Not a single clearly defined nation, not a well-documented empire, just this label that shows up in Egyptian records describing groups of raiders arriving by sea, attacking coastal cities, and causing serious disruption. And that's basically all we have. No clear origin, no unified identity, just fragments, names of groups, hints that they might have come from different places like the Aegean, Western Asia Minor, Mediterranean islands, maybe even parts of Southern Europe, but nothing that fully ties it together into one coherent story. Which is what makes it feel so strange, because they show up at a moment where multiple civilizations are already under pressure, and instead of being a clearly understood force, they're more like a catalyst that pushes everything over the edge, almost like the final blow in a system that was already starting to crack. And then they disappear, or rather, they stop being identifiable as this distinct thing. No clear continuation, no obvious "this is what they became" in a way that fully explains who they were. So, you're left with this picture of a major historical disruption, entire regions destabilized, with one of the key factors being a group of people we still don't really understand. And that's what sticks. Because it's not just that they were destructive, it's that they're incomplete, like a missing piece in a story that we can see the effects of, but can't fully explain. And once you realize that, it kind of makes history feel less solid than it usually does. More like a puzzle with some of the most important pieces still missing. Story 32. The catacombs under Paris are one of those places that don't just feel eerie because of what's there, but because of how casual their existence almost seems on the surface. Because above ground, you've got one of the most famous, busy cities in the world. Cafes, traffic, tourists, everyday life moving like nothing's out of the ordinary. And then beneath all of that, miles and miles of tunnels, lined with human bones. Not a few, not scattered remains. Entire walls built from skulls and femurs, carefully stacked, arranged, almost organized in a way that makes it feel less like a burial and more like a structure made out of people. And the scale is what really gets you. We're talking about the remains of millions of individuals moved there centuries ago when Paris's cemeteries became overcrowded, and instead of expanding outward, they went down, deep underground, out of sight. And that's where it starts to feel unsettling in a different way. Because these aren't ancient forgotten ruins from some distant civilization. These are relatively recent in the grand scheme of things, tied directly to a city that's still alive, still functioning, still thriving right above them. So you've got this contrast, life on top, death underneath, separated by just a few layers of earth and stone. And then there's the fact that the catacombs aren't fully mapped or explored in the way people assume. There are sections closed off, tunnels that branch out, spaces that aren't part of the official paths, and stories of people getting lost down there don't feel that far-fetched once you realize how extensive it actually is. And that's what sticks with you. It's not just the bones. It's the idea that beneath something so familiar, so active, there's this entire hidden layer that most people never think about, silent, massive, and always there, right under your feet. Story 33. Microbes in the permafrost are one of those things that don't sound that unsettling at first, until you really think about what permafrost actually means. Because we're not just talking about cold soil. We're talking about ground that has been frozen solid for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years, basically acting like a natural time capsule that locked away whatever was inside it at the moment it froze. And that includes microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, entire microscopic ecosystems that existed in a completely different world, under completely different conditions, just sitting there, dormant, not dead, just waiting. And the part that makes it weird is that some of them can actually be revived. There have already been cases where ancient microbes were brought back to activity in controlled environments, which means they didn't just survive being frozen for that long, they were still viable, and that's where it starts to feel a little off. Because these aren't things that evolved alongside us, they belong to ecosystems that existed long before modern humans, and potentially interact with biology in ways we don't fully understand anymore. And now, with permafrost melting faster due to rising temperatures, those layers aren't staying sealed anymore. They're thawing, which means whatever was trapped there isn't just being discovered, it's being released. And not in a controlled lab setting, but into real environments, into water systems, soil, air. And that's the unsettling part. It's not dramatic, it's not immediate. It's just this slow, quiet process of things that were sealed away for a reason becoming part of the present again. Things we've never encountered before, or haven't encountered in a very, very long time, and we don't fully know what all of it is, which makes it less about any one discovery, and more about the idea that there is an entire hidden layer of life beneath us that's starting to come back into contact with the world, after being gone longer than anything we've ever experienced. And that's just sitting there, waiting to thaw. Story 34. One of the most unsettling patterns in archaeology isn't a single discovery. It's the repetition of the same story playing out over and over again across completely different civilizations. Because when you look at places like the Vikings in Greenland, the Chaco culture, the Maya, the Akkadian Empire, these weren't small, fragile societies. They were established, organized, adapted to their environments, in some cases thriving for centuries. And then something shifts. Climate changes, resources get stretched, systems that worked for a long time start to break down, and instead of a sudden collapse, you often see this slow unraveling that eventually turns into abandonment or disappearance. The Vikings in Greenland, for example, managed to survive for generations in a harsh environment, but as conditions cooled and resources became harder to sustain, their settlements gradually faded out. The Maya built massive cities and complex systems, but prolonged droughts combined with environmental strain appear to have contributed to their decline in many regions. The Akkadian Empire, one of the first major empires, seems to have been hit by severe drought that disrupted agriculture and stability, and Chaco, a whole network of structures and communities that were clearly planned and connected, eventually left behind. And what makes this unsettling isn't just that they collapsed, it's how similar the underlying pressures look. Not identical, not perfectly understood, but familiar enough that you start to see a pattern. Systems growing, relying on resources, pushing limits, and then struggling when those limits shift or get exceeded. And the part that sticks with you is how normal it probably felt while it was happening, because these weren't societies that thought they were at the end. They were just living, adapting, making decisions within the conditions they had, probably assuming things would continue the way they always had, until they didn't. And that's what makes it hit differently, because it's not just about what happened to them, it's about realizing that collapse doesn't always come from something dramatic or external. Sometimes it's gradual, sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's just the environment changing faster than a system can handle. And when you see that pattern repeated across history, across different places, different cultures, it stops feeling like isolated events and starts feeling like something much more universal, which is what makes it unsettling. Because it suggests that even complex, successful systems aren't immune to those kinds of pressures. They're just part of them. Story 35. The realization that the shift to farming may have actually made early humans physically worse off, at least in a lot of ways, is one of those ideas that really flips the progress narrative on its head. Because we're usually taught that agriculture was this major upgrade, more food, stable settlements, the foundation for civilization, basically the moment everything started improving. But when you look at the skeletal evidence, it tells a more complicated story. Early farming populations often show signs of being shorter, having more nutritional deficiencies, more disease, more dental problems, and in many cases, shorter lifespans compared to the hunter-gatherers that came before them, which is kind of counterintuitive, because you would expect a steady food supply to make things better, not worse. But what seems to have happened is that diets became less varied, more dependent on a few staple crops, and living in settled communities made it easier for diseases to spread, while workloads in some cases actually increased rather than decreased. So, instead of this clean upgrade, it looks more like a trade-off. Stability and growth in exchange for individual health, at least in the early stages. And that's what makes it unsettling, because it challenges this idea that every major step forward in human development automatically improves quality of life. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it creates entirely new problems. And the people living through that transition probably didn't see it as a clear improvement either. They were just adapting to a new way of living, one that eventually led to everything we have now, but at a cost that's easy to overlook when you only look at the long-term outcome. And that's the part that sticks, because it suggests that what we think of as progress isn't always a straight line upward. It's a series of trade-offs that only make sense in hindsight. Story 36, that lake at the bottom of the ocean, is one of those things that sounds completely impossible at first, until you realize it's real, and then it somehow becomes even more unsettling, because the idea of a lake inside the ocean doesn't make sense in your head. Water inside water, it should just mix, right? But in certain places, especially in the deep ocean, you get these pockets of extremely salty, dense water called brine pools that are so different from the surrounding seawater that they actually form distinct boundaries. So when a submarine or remotely operated vehicle approaches one of these, it can look like a shoreline. You can literally see waves, ripples, even what looks like a surface separating one body of liquid from another. And because that brine is so dense, it behaves almost like a different medium entirely. There have been cases where submersibles or equipment interact with it in a way that feels less like moving through water, and more like hitting something thicker, almost resisting entry, which is where that bouncing off idea comes from. And then you look at what's inside these pools, and it gets even stranger. The conditions are so extreme, low oxygen, high salinity, toxic chemicals, that most life can't survive there. So anything that falls into it, fish, organisms, just dies and gets preserved in this kind of eerie, still environment. You end up with this layer at the bottom of the ocean that's almost like a trap, a separate world, completely still, often darker, more toxic, with its own strange chemistry, just sitting there beneath everything else. And that's what makes it unsettling, because it's not just the deep ocean, which is already alien enough. It's a place within that place, a boundary you can see but don't fully expect, where the rules feel just slightly different, like you found something that shouldn't exist. But anyway, right there, at the bottom of the world. Story 37. The Toland Man is one of those discoveries that doesn't feel like archaeology at all when you first see it. It feels like you're looking at someone who died recently. Because he was found in a peat bog in Denmark, and instead of a skeleton, his body was preserved so well that his face still has expression, his skin still intact, even the stubble on his chin visible, like he could just wake up at any moment. And that's already unsettling. But then you find out how he died. He was hanged. There's still a rope around his neck. And the expression on his face isn't what you'd expect from something violent or chaotic. It's calm, almost peaceful, which somehow makes it even more disturbing because it doesn't match what you know happened. And then it gets stranger, because this wasn't just a random death. Evidence suggests he may have been a ritual sacrifice, possibly offered to gods or as part of some kind of ceremony. And after he died, his body was placed carefully into the bog, almost like it was meant to be preserved rather than discarded. And the bog itself is what makes all of this possible. The acidic low-oxygen environment basically stops decomposition in a very specific way, preserving soft tissue while dissolving bone, which is why he looks so intact in ways that feel completely wrong for something over 2,000 years old. So, instead of a skeleton, you're looking at a person, a face, a moment frozen in time. And that's what really sticks with you, because most of archaeology creates distance. Bones, fragments, ruins. This removes that distance completely. It makes the past feel immediate, too immediate. Like, you're not just studying history, you're looking at someone who was there. And that kind of closeness is what makes it unsettling in a way that's hard to shake. Story 38. The Antikythera mechanism is one of those discoveries that isn't disturbing in a scary way, but more in a this shouldn't exist yet kind of way that just quietly breaks your sense of historical progression. So, this thing was pulled up from a shipwreck off the coast of Greece, dated to around 100 BC, and at first, it just looked like a lump of corroded bronze, nothing too special. Then they started looking closer, and inside it, gears, dozens of them, interlocking, precise, arranged in a way that clearly wasn't random. And not just simple mechanics either. This thing could track astronomical positions, predict eclipses, follow planetary cycles, basically function like an ancient analog computer, which sounds completely out of place for that time, because you don't really see technology at that level of complexity again until well over 1,000 years later. So now you've got this one device that suggests someone, somewhere, had figured out incredibly advanced mechanical engineering, and then that knowledge just didn't carry forward in any obvious way. It's like a glimpse of something ahead of its time. That got lost. And that's the part that makes it stick, because it raises questions you can't fully answer. Was this a one-off invention? Were there more like it? How much knowledge existed that we never saw again? And the fact that it ended up at the bottom of the sea, preserved just enough for us to find it, feels almost accidental, like we weren't really supposed to know it existed at all. And that kind of quiet, out-of-place discovery is unsettling in a very different way. Not because it's dark, but because it suggests history might not be as linear as we like to think. Story 39. The Baghdad Battery is one of those discoveries that isn't scary or disturbing in the usual sense. It's just quietly confusing in a way that makes you question how much we actually understand about ancient technology. So, It's this small clay jar found near Baghdad, dated to around 200 BC, and inside it you've got a copper cylinder and an iron rod, basically arranged in a way that looks suspiciously like a simple electrochemical cell. And when people recreated it with an acidic liquid like vinegar or lemon juice, it actually produced a small electric current, which is where things get weird. Because if that's what it was used for, it would suggest that people back then had at least some practical understanding of electricity, not in a modern scientific sense, but enough to generate and possibly use it for something. But for what? That's the part no one really agrees on. Some think it might have been used for electroplating, like coating objects with thin layers of metal. Others think it could have been ceremonial or experimental. And some argue it might not have been a battery at all, just something that happens to resemble one. And that uncertainty is what makes it interesting, because it sits in this gray area where it's just advanced enough to raise eyebrows, but not well documented enough to explain itself. It's not rewriting history, but it's nudging it, making you wonder how many small, practical discoveries might have been made, used, and then forgotten, without ever turning into something bigger or being recorded in a way that survived. And that's what sticks. Not that ancient people had modern tech, but that they might have had glimpses of ideas we associate with much later periods, just in forms that didn't leave a clear trail, which makes history feel a little less like a straight line, and a bit more like scattered sparks that didn't always catch. Story 40, the Longyou Caves in China, are one of those discoveries that aren't scary or grim. They're just so weirdly unexplained that they stick with you. So, these caves were discovered in the 1990s when locals started draining what they thought were just ordinary ponds. And instead of hitting natural rock formations, they uncovered massive man-made underground chambers, and not small ones either. We're talking huge spaces carved directly into solid rock with pillars left behind for support, walls covered in these consistent parallel chisel marks, all done with a level of precision that looks almost modern in its uniformity. And there are dozens of these caves, all connected, all following similar patterns, all clearly intentional. But here's the strange part. There are no clear historical records explaining who built them, why they were built, or how something that massive was organized and completed without leaving behind detailed documentation, which is odd, because ancient China kept pretty extensive records of major projects. So now you've got this situation where a huge amount of labor, planning, and effort clearly went into creating something underground, something that must have taken years, if not decades. And yet it barely shows up in written history. No clear purpose either. They don't fit neatly into being tombs, mines, or typical living spaces. And the uniform design suggests it wasn't just random excavation. It was planned, deliberate, and then seemingly forgotten. And that's what makes it interesting. Not because it's dark or dangerous, but because it's this massive, undeniable human effort that somehow slipped through the cracks of recorded history. Like finding a fully built structure with no clear story attached to it. Which makes you wonder how many other things like that exist. Not hidden in a mysterious way, just overlooked, waiting for someone to realize what they're actually looking at.